Hi everybody. I thought it'd be a good idea to make a couple of videos about data in Blender because we want to get to using scenes in Blender a little more often to control what we render and to give us some flexibility in what we're doing. But to get that to work and not be frustrated, there's a lot of terms that are very Blender specific that we need to know about so that we know what we're doing when we say delete an object or we unlink a collection. All of these things can be a head scratcher if we don't lay out some basic principles about how Blender handles things. So I'm going to make a few videos. The first one here is a little bit of theory and some terms. We're going to try to demystify some things. And the second video will be some examples in Blender of what that means in practice, how you would find this information in your Blender file, what you can do with it. And the third video will be like a real-world example with a kitchen scene, where we'll put all of this into practice and make a file that has two scenes in it. So this first video is theory, and we're going to start with the most basic thing in Blender, which is called a data block. So I've got this little backdrop here, and I've called it myfile.blend. So this is a representation of your Blender file. And so the first thing to understand is that all a Blender file is a database, and in that database, the entries in the database are called data blocks. And a data block is not one kind of thing. It could be many, many kinds of things, okay? Everything in this box are examples of data blocks. All of these are data blocks, okay? And what's important to know is there's no hierarchy in this database. What I mean by that is you might be tempted to think, okay, well, I've seen a collection, and objects are in a collection, so the collection owns this object. And the object owns the mesh that's in the object, right? And the mesh, I know that they're tied to material, so the mesh owns the material like this. That's not how this database works. Everything here is equal with everything else. In other words, if there were true that there were a kind of ownership hierarchy, and I were to delete a collection, well, you would expect that I would also delete the object and the mesh and the material and everything downstream. But that doesn't happen. All of these things, no matter how great or small, are independent in terms of the file itself, right? They're entries in this database. Okay, instead of a hierarchy, what we have in Blender is the idea of users, okay? And when one data block is using another, we call that linked. They're linked, okay? I have some things over here written down to try and make this clear. This is what we just talked about. There's no inherent hierarchy. So this is important here. Instead, each data block is linked by at least one other data block. Data blocks that are linking to a given data block are its users in Blender speak, okay? So how our previous example actually works is the collection is linked to the object, meaning the collection is a user of this object. This object is a user of the mesh. The mesh is a user of the material, okay? That's how we talk about things in Blender. And the difference being that everything in Blender is not one-to-one as far as like an owner and an owned. It's one-to-many, right? So this object can have many users. Let's say, for example, we had a situation where we have 3 collections, all of them different, okay? And all of them are users of this object, okay? We can have one-to-many relationships. There's nothing in Blender that's important about, let's say, this collection being the first one to have used this object. All of these are equal with each other. They're just data blocks. This one, and this one, and this one, all 3 are data blocks, so is the object, okay? But it does not matter that this was the first one to use the object or anything like that. They're all users of the object. Similarly, an object, let's say we had a scene with many objects. We'll duplicate, we'll make like 3, okay? In Blender speak, these objects, each of these is a data block, but all of them could be users of the same mesh, one mesh, right? This we call instancing, and you've seen that before. This is what instancing is. All of these objects are users of a single mesh, okay? That's the difference, and that's the reason why this system is like this, because it allows one-to-many relationships among everything that's in the database, okay? That's what's going on. Okay, so let's go through another couple concepts. If a data block has no users, it's considered no longer needed and deleted from the database. And we'll go over that in detail down below a little bit. That's what happens when we refer to something as an orphan in Blender. Okay, so if we say, let's say all of these objects, none of these objects are users of this mesh any longer, okay, then this mesh becomes an orphan. And if we don't create a user for it, that gets deleted the next time we open the blend file, because this database is always looking to keep itself efficient. And so if there's if there's data blocks in this database that are no longer needed, then it gets rid of them, okay? We can stop that from happening, and we can use that to our advantage as well, but that's the concept. Every data block has at least one user in Blender, or it's removed from the file. That's the core concept. Over here on the side, I have all of the different data blocks that are in Blender. This list right here are all of the different things that can be a data block, okay? And you can see some familiar things in here. There's a camera, there's a collection, right? Where is mesh? Obviously, there's mesh. Object is in here somewhere. It's object. Okay, all these things. These are all of the different data block types that can be in the Blender database, okay? So everything in this list appears over here somewhere, plus many more that we haven't gone over, but these are the most common, okay? So if you're curious, that's the list. That's what they are. Okay, for your particular file, whatever Blender file you're in, you can see what data blocks make up your file by looking at the Blender file mode of the outliner. So if I come over here, and this is my outliner, and I change the mode here, the standard is view layer. If I change this to Blender file, all of these top level categories, these are the data blocks that are in your scene. So not the exhaustive list of all that are possible, but these are the ones that are in your scene. So you can see here my scene has one action that I'm using that's actually driving this cube animating around. An action is what stores animation in Blender. Okay. We have some collections, all right, and so on. Now, it can be a little confusing because the top level here is the data block being referenced by this here, but this is also an outliner, so it's trying to be convenient and showing you the hierarchy the same as if you were looking at it any other way, but the cubes are not collections. It's a little bit confusing view. It's just a way to kind of navigate through and see things a different way. All right, the collection is the data block in this case. All right, objects also appear down here. All of these are objects. You can see they have different types. We'll talk about that in a minute, a little bit. But those are all the objects. Whatever. So you can see in your scene, if you're curious, what all the data blocks are that make up your scene with this top level list. Okay? All right, so that said, it then becomes important to know which data blocks are the users of which. All right, so what I've done here is lay out all of the different data blocks that I had in my representation of the database here. I've just taken and copied them and laid them out according to which ones use which other ones, okay? So let's start with the scene. You can think of the only user of the scene is the Blender file itself. So it kind of, this is maybe the exception. The scene is not used by anything other than the Blender file itself, okay? Well, what can a scene be a user of? Well, a scene can be a user of a collection. It can be a user of the world data block. You've all dealt with the worlds by this point. Or it can be the user of a node tree. If you go into the compositor and you make a compositing group, that's called a node tree. And that's its own data block, and the scene can be a user of that, which means we can reuse those node trees many, many times in the scene, referencing the same one. Okay, let's keep moving on here. A collection can be a user of another collection. All right, that's what happens if we have here, I've made, if I make a sub collection here. I'm using the term sub collection, but that's not really a thing. What I'm doing is making a new collection at the database level and making this collection a user of this one, okay? There's nothing about collection 1 that has anything really to do with collection other than collection is a user of collection 1. And so they have this hierarchical relationship in the outliner here, okay? But there's nothing that like ties these two together for all time. That's just the one's a user of the other right now, okay? That's what that means. A collection is also a user of objects, and that's the thing you're probably most familiar with is, right, we have, as represented again in the outliner, this collection doesn't own these objects, right? But this collection is a user of each one of these objects, okay? An object is a user of what Blender calls object data, but that's just shorthand for any number of different kinds of data blocks. And Blender always shows these in green, okay? If you see something in green like this, it's an object data, or sorry, it's what's called object data, which is confusing, but what it really is a mesh data block, a curve data block, a light data block, and so on. The category down here, you'll always see in your properties, there's a green icon down here, and that changes depending on what you have highlighted. So if I have a cube highlighted, you'll see I get this icon here. It just says object data properties, but that's like a catch-all. You'll see that the icon is the mesh data icon. So if I click on this, what I'm looking at are the properties, right, of the mesh data block, which is currently being used by this cube, okay? And if I hover over this menu, you'll actually see it'll say browse mesh data to be linked, okay? I can't attach anything I want to this kind of object. It's got to be this kind of data block. And if I go to like a text object, down here that's changed now, this is actually a font data block, although it calls it curve data in the menu. Okay, that's the data block. This text.001 is a data block being used by this object text001, okay? So these are dependent on what kind of object you have, which can be a little confusing because we'll get into object types, okay? There are many types of objects in Blender. Objects are always orange colored in Blender. And you say, well, what are the types? The types are what you see if you do a Shift-A to add something in Blender. If you do this top menu here, these are all objects, except for this real-time materials. Ignore that. All of these are objects. And their type just defines what kind of data blocks that they can be users of. That's the way to think about it, right? What separates a camera from a mesh? Well, a camera can only take a camera data block, or it can only be a user of a camera data block. A mesh can only be the user of a mesh data block, okay? That's the way it's organized. I have this in this thing off to the side too. You can see if you're looking at this file later on, okay? Those are all of the object types, okay? And so we keep going down. A mesh is a user of a material, right? And you've seen in practice already that, you know, many meshes, which you've probably called many objects, but many meshes can use the same material in Blender. A material can be a user of an image data block. When images come in, Blender treats them as entries that can be reused in its database. It doesn't necessarily import the image into the file. The image data block may just be a link to an image on disk, but in the database it treats it as its own item that can be reused among many materials. Okay? So what happens when we delete a data block versus unlink a data block? This is going to be the next important concept. Delete versus unlink. All right, so delete first. When we, when we delete something, when we delete a data block in Blender, what that means is immediately remove it from the database, like all the way back up here, okay? Do not pass go, do not collect $200, delete immediately from the database. It's gone. That's what delete in Blender means, okay? So if we do that, that's going to have repercussions for the data blocks that use that data block and the ones that are used by that data block. So let's use the example of this object here. If I were to delete an object here, what does that actually mean under the hood? Well, let's look at this. I have two scenes. These are both data blocks again. Each one has a single collection, okay? But both of those collections are users of this object, meaning that object is going to appear in both scenes. That's what this means, and we'll go over this a little later when we get to practical examples. The object is also the user of a mesh. And let's say, for example, that I've got a geometry nodes modifier on the object, so it's also the user of a node tree, and that node tree has a group in it, so there's a couple of node trees involved, okay, just for our example's sake. So what happens if I delete this? Well, if I delete it, I'm going to automatically unlink it, right, remove the users from it for every user that was using that object. So what that means is, if I come here, and let's go, I think it's this one, nope. There we go. So what that means is I've removed both of these collections, as users of that object. And what that'll mean in practice is that that object no longer appears in either of these collections, in either of these scenes. So I could be looking at scene 1 and delete that object, and unbeknownst to me, it is gone from scene 2 as well. And the reason for that is the object is its own entity in the database, its own data block. And I've said delete it, which means remove it everywhere that that object was found. Okay? Now, what happens downstream, if you will, from that object? Well, this mesh, let's say, had only one user, which was the object. So now this mesh has no users. Okay? Likewise, this node tree was being used only by that object, let's say, for example. Now it has no users. Oops, where did I put my, there we go. It has no users, okay? So what we've made here are what are called orphans. This mesh and this node tree have now become orphans because I have deleted their only user, okay? And what will happen then is these will remain in the database until I close Blender and reopen it, at which time they'll be deleted because Blender is assuming, hey, there's no users of this, therefore I don't need them and they'll go away, okay? Now, we can protect that from happening, which we'll get into a little later, by making what's called a fake user for these things to keep them around in case we do want them later, even though we have no current use for them now. And you've seen that badge, that fake user icon. If I go to, let's say, a mesh here, okay, down here in the corner, this badge right here, this is called fake user. And what that means, fake user is a dumb word for this, but it means make the user count of this data block always 1 at least, right? Never 0. Meaning even if it's no longer used by anyone, it's going to hang around in the Blender file, okay? You'll see this in materials, you'll see this in meshes. That's what this little shield icon means and how you use it, right? Okay, that's what that is. Most common, you use this with materials. You use it all the time with materials because you might be trying several things and wanting to come back to previous materials. So you want to get in the habit of being pretty liberal with this protector shield, this fake user, on materials that you might want later. Okay? That's what that means. Okay, so let's follow this through a second. Blender is also thinking about orphans recursively. What I mean by that is, right now, in our scenario, there's 0 users for these two, but there's still 1 user for this node tree used as a group in another node tree, right? It still has a user, which is this node tree, but this node tree has 0 users. So Blender is smart enough to know, hey, if this has 0 users, and I'm going to delete it next time, that means, by definition, this is going to have 0 users, and I'm also going to delete it, okay? So you, by deleting the object, getting back to kind of what we were talking about, the next time you save and open Blender, you have also deleted these data blocks from your Blender file, okay? You've removed these 2 data blocks as users of the object, but you have deleted these data blocks entirely because they have 0 users. That's the concept there, okay? Okay, that's delete. When we delete something in Blender, that's what it means. What about unlink? And I'm going to just move these a second so it's a little clearer. This is unlink, what we're talking about. All right, the above, this is the scenario of deleting something. Okay, what happens if we unlink it? Well, unlink means to remove the data block from its current user. Okay, so let's look at our, like a similar example again. So let's say I'm currently in scene 2, all right, and I'm looking at this object in scene 2, and I right-click on it, and I unlink it. I didn't delete it, I unlinked it. Well, what's that do? What that does is remove the current user, so I'm looking at it in scene 2. That means that collection 2 is the current user that I'm interested in when I right-click on this object. And so by unlinking it, let me find where my note is, I'm removing, there we go, I am removing collection 2 as a user of this object, okay? So what that means is as I'm looking at collection 2, that object no longer appears, it's gone out of my scene, right? It's not in my scene anymore, but it is in the database, and nothing bad will happen to it because it still has another user, right? In scene 1, my object is still there, And this collection is still a user of that object. Unlinking means remove it from the current user, okay? This becomes very, very powerful later. So nothing bad will happen to object or any of its downstream data blocks in this scenario because I've just removed it from this scene rather than the entire file. Anytime you see unlink in Blender, that's what unlink means. It's weird because when you like right click on a thing, you'll see unlink here and it has no context. Like what unlink? Unlink from what? What are you talking about? That's what it always means. Unlink means remove it from its current user. Okay? So we're going to use this when we set up scenes a great deal. Okay, a little bit of recap here. We talked about this already, but if a data block is unlinked from all of its users, it becomes an orphan. Orphans will be deleted the next time the Blender file is loaded unless they have a user, and we protect them like I talked about before by making a fake user for them. A fake user makes the user count of a data block at least 1, even if there are no other users, and therefore it's never deleted. Okay? Okay, what's next? Is everything in Blender a data block? No. Data blocks each have properties, and sometimes you would think those properties might themselves be data blocks, but they're not. They belong to the other data blocks. Okay? So what are some examples? Well, for the scene data block, these are all of its properties, and you can actually see this over here in the properties window. So these top 4 in white here, you see these? These are all properties of the scene data block. And you can see that if I click on render and I hover, you'll see actually that says render properties. It's kind of flashing weird. Output says output properties, view layer properties. But if you click on each one, you see the icon up here, right? There's properties of what? Properties of the scene, right? If I called this scene, my scene, okay, this changes down here. This is the data block that we're modifying. So anything we set up that's a render parameter, or an output, or a resolution, or frame range, all of this stuff, these are properties of the scene. Now later on when we start setting up scenes, this is why that is powerful, because the scene carries with it all of these properties which can then be modified. You can have an identical set of objects, let's say, in 2 scenes, an identical set of collections, but manipulate how they're rendered, what the frame ranges are, and all of this stuff separately, okay? Properties of the scene. And each one of these we click, you'll see up here it says scene, okay? My scene, view layer. View layer is not itself a data block. It is a property of my scene, okay? And so on here, okay? How about an object? We come down here, we see a bunch of object properties that you're familiar with. Obviously, its coordinate system, that is, its location, rotation, and scale. Also, the object's parent. A parent in Blender, that's a property of the object, right? The parent does not own the object. The parenting relationship is just a property on each object. Does it have a parent? Who is that parent? Okay? It's just displayed in the outliner as a hierarchy to make things like sensible to look at. But parent is a property of the object. What else are? Well, all of these tabs in blue are. So let's go to a cube one so we see the most tabs, okay? All of these in blue, if I click on them, all right, up at the top, look at this, all right? Cube up here, okay, the modifier. And now geometry nodes is a little specific because it also has a thing, don't worry about that. But if I put like, let's put a bevel down, okay? These modifiers are properties of the object, okay? Up here you see cube. Same thing, particles, property of the object. Physics information, property of the object. Constraints, property of the object, okay? All of these ones in blue, those all belong to the object as properties. They are not themselves data blocks, okay? How about for a mesh? Let's look at this cube's mesh here. Vertex groups. Shape keys, kind of. A shape key in Blender also is a data block, but don't worry about that. It's not really, don't let that get confusing. Okay? But UV maps you can find down here, right? If you have UV maps, one or many of them, those are properties of the mesh, as are all kinds of just attributes that you arbitrarily add, right? If you're making attributes either in geometry nodes or ones that come natively or whatever, all of those are properties of the mesh, okay? And then the last one, which is interesting, is armature. So if I make an armature here. Whoops, not a lattice. Armature, there we go. We have an armature object, right? Well, the armature object is using this armature data block, okay? The bones are not data blocks, they are properties of the armature, okay? Bones and bone constraints are all properties of the armature. The armature, this green one, this is the data block, okay? As is the object that uses it. This armature object is a user of this armature data block, okay? So, yeah, so that's properties, okay? So understanding what properties belong to what data block helps you kind of manage and use that to your advantage. So we'll leave it here for the first video. In the next video, we're going to go through a few very, very common scenarios where understanding what we just talked about is going to make life in Blender so much easier and allow you to do stuff that maybe you haven't even thought of doing because of how all of this works. So we'll pick it up in the next one and we'll do some practical examples.